Hello, this is our presentation on the cost of not spending, why Florida should not decrease funding to USF, and the group members are Olivia, Nick, Sarah, and Cheyenne. For the table of contents, our position is on slide 3, our background information is on slide 4, decreased funding to USF leads to increased tuition for students information is on slide 5 through 6, budget cuts for the university information is on slides 7 through 9, a loss in longer-term investments information is on slides 10 through 11. And then for our opposition points, does decreased funding always lead to increased tuition / does more funding for states universities always mean more funding for their students are on slides 12 through 13. Our summary and restatement is on slide 14 and references are on slide 15. Our position for this project is the state of Florida should not decrease funding for the University of South Florida. In background context and why we support this position, the state of Florida continually decreases funding for state universities like USF each year. When states decrease funding for their university, this requires the schools to account for the loss of funding in whichever way they see best fit for the current condition of their university and how it will continue to run. Decreasing state funding for the University of South Florida could lead to increased tuition, budget cuts, and a loss of long-term investments, which will harm both the university and its students, as well as the state itself. In the current circumstances that USF is in due to experiencing a global pandemic and shutdowns, Florida decreasing funding for the university could seriously harm the state of the university and its students. So claim 1 is decreased funding for USF leads to increased tuition for students. And our position was no, that the state should not decrease funding for USF. And the claim is that a decrease in funding could have major consequences that have a direct negative impact on the students, such as increased tuition. In the claim's connection to the position, the negative impact that prior cuts have caused perfectly conveys the harm on students and their education that arises from decreasing funds and potential damage of future cuts. The increased tuition that has emerged from states decreasing funds for universities supports the position that the state of Florida should not decrease funds for USF because of the harmful effects that it has caused students from making college less affordable for them, more than it already is, to compromising the quality of their education and jeopardizing their success. So claim 1 evidence. We have 3 quotes for the evidence from the source Mitchell and Michael. In the evidence connection to the claim, the evidence fully supports the claim because it shows a direct correlation between public universities raising tuition in response to state funding cuts, making college less affordable. It supports the idea that the state of Florida should not decrease funds for USF because this rise in tuition not only makes college less accessible, it also harms their educational experience as well. So for claim 2, it is Florida decreasing funding for USF leads to budget cuts for the university. And our position is obviously that the state should not decrease funding for USF. The claim is if Florida decreases funding for USF, this will lead to USF having to implement budget cuts across the university due to the lack of funding from the state. The claim's connection to the position, if the state of Florida decreases funding for USF, this will lead the university to have to implement several budget cuts that will hinder the way their university runs. Implementing budget cuts within a state university leads to the success of its students being hindered due to the areas that the university is led to cut in. Therefore, the state should not decrease funding for the University of South Florida because that will only cause more hardships for the university, its faculty members, and therefore the success of its students. And for evidence, budget cuts lead universities to cut program areas, faculty numbers, and special programs and research opportunities that all affect the success and opportunities of the university students. And in the 2 quotes on this page, it shows how they will implement a $36.7 million budget cut in the coming years, and also how faculty members are taking the news of this budget cut during the pandemic, how they're afraid that it's going to make their situation worse than it already was. And then in the next evidence continued, in this quote, it shows how some cuts that USF is going to be making are cuts to programs that were put in place to improve student success, which will obviously harm the way the university was currently running and the performance numbers that they were achieving each year. And the evidence connection to the claim. This evidence shows how the state reducing its funding to USF leads them to have to implement a series of budget cuts that include not being able to hire new staff members for their growing student population, hurting both student success and the university faculty members. Also, it leads the university to make cuts to special programs that help their students succeed and enjoy their time at their chosen university. Overall, this shows how the state decreasing funding to USF leads them to implement budget cuts that hinder their students' performance and success through loss of faculty and program areas. And then our claim 3 is Florida decreasing funding for USF results in the state losing out on longer-term investments. USF provides a unique opportunity to create employment and earn grants. So if Florida were to decrease funding for the University of South Florida, it could mean losing out on longer-term investments. USF provides many unique opportunities that help earn money for Florida and create jobs, but funding cuts can stifle these benefits. One example of this is the USF Health, which has been experiencing 3 consecutive years of budget cuts. USF Health is a medical school consisting of 3 branches: research, education, and clinical programs, and part of its income relies on preeminent funding given to USF by the state. Research, according to the USF Health Dean, is said to be the first branch to receive cuts due to decreased funding. USF Health research is important to the Tampa Bay and Florida economy because every $1 put into the research produces $2.30 for the economy. Additionally, USF research can receive grants and funding that earn money on top of that. So the evidence for Claim 3, USF's clinical program, specifically the pediatric branch, has also been impacted by decreased funding, this time straight from the Florida Governor's Office. Typically, this portion of USF Health benefits Florida by training employment for pediatricians, which is an area in the state that is currently experiencing a shortage in. In our opposition for this project is that more funding for states' universities does not always mean more funding for their students. For the opposition, it is possible that more funding for the state's universities does not always mean more funding for their students. The article What More Funding for State Universities by Students shows this point by arguing that throwing taxpayer money at universities will not fix the problem of high tuition rates. The author also states that increasing funding will allow universities to increase spending, but not necessarily for their students' benefit. Another piece of evidence that the opposition provides is that on a per-student basis, funding is up to $1,117 over the past 5 years. Despite this, the SHEEO report shows that per-student tuition revenue actually increased by $839 in that 5-year span. What this implies is that in the last 5 years, state funding for universities has actually gone up in total. But despite this increase, they're still bringing in an increased amount of tuition revenue instead of decreasing tuition. And for our refutation, it is proven that decreased funding or decreasing budgets leads to higher tuition and budget cuts, while increased budget has potential for improving a school. This connects to our overarching position that the state of Florida should not decrease its funding for USF. This is because even if an increased budget does not necessarily imply lower tuition rates, the university will be increasing its funding in all sectors. This includes academic and research improvements. If USF puts a higher budget toward academic and research purposes, it will inherently create a better learning environment and experiences for its students. Some evidence that supports this is that new research from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston finds that strong evidence that public universities raise tuition in response to state funding cuts. Not decreasing this funding in the first place solves any problem of increasing tuition. For our summary and restatement, state funding to the University of South Florida is important for its ability to fully serve its students and the economy. Decreasing funding to USF could burden its students with raised tuition as shown by four-year colleges across the country, force budget cuts within the university that hurt student performance, and cause long-term losses to the Florida economy. In contrast to those negative effects, some may claim that decreasing funding is not associated with increased tuition. However, research suggests that this claim is not true. Plus, a few exceptions will still use increased funding to improve student resources. Given this information, Florida should not decrease funding to the University of South Florida. And then here are the references that we use throughout this presentation for our claims and our opposition points. And that is all.